Why nations collapsed when credit ceased to flow at first? Nothing looks broken. The lights still turn on, markets still open, governments still speak with confidence. But beneath the surface, something vital has stopped moving. Not money you can see, not coins or notes or gold. Credit, the invisible bloodstream of modern civilization. And when that flow slows, then freezes. Nations don't collapse loudly. They suffocate quietly. This is the paradox at the heart of economic history. Countries rarely fall because they are poor. They fall because trust disappears, and with it, credit. To understand why nations collapse when credit stops flowing, we must first confront an uncomfortable truth. Money builds empires, but credit sustains them. For most of human history, economies were constrained by what physically existed. Grain, land, silver, labor. Growth was slow, limited, tangible. But as societies expanded, something revolutionary emerged. The idea that future value could be borrowed into the present. Credit was not just a financial invention, it was a promise. A promise that tomorrow would be productive enough to repay today. Empires rose on this promise. From ancient Mesopotamian clay tablets recording debt, to Roman banking houses financing trade across continents, credit allowed societies to grow beyond the limits of physical wealth. It turned time itself into an economic resource. But credit depends on belief, and belief is fragile. The Roman Empire understood this early and ignored it too late. At its height, Rome was not sustained by gold alone, but by confidence in its system. Taxes flowed, soldiers were paid, trade routes functioned, and credit extended from merchants to the state itself. But as military costs ballooned and expansion slowed, Rome faced a familiar dilemma. Obligations exceeded resources. Rather than default openly, emperors diluted trust quietly. Coins were debased. Silver content fell. Inflation followed. Creditors demanded more for the same loans or stopped lending altogether. Once credit dried up, commerce slowed. Soldiers went unpaid. Local economies fragmented. The empire did not collapse in a single moment. It decayed, not from invasion, but from financial paralysis. Centuries later, the same pattern repeated in more sophisticated forms. In 16th century Spain, unimaginable wealth flowed in from the New World. Gold and silver from the Americas funded wars, palaces, and power. But Spain spent faster than it earned. To bridge the gap, it borrowed heavily from Italian and German bankers who trusted imperial dominance, till they didn't. Spain defaulted multiple times. Each default shattered confidence further. Credit became more expensive. Eventually, lenders withdrew. The empire that ruled the seas found itself unable to finance its ambitions. Not because resources vanished, but because trust had. Credit collapses rarely begin with catastrophe. They begin with stress. A war stretches finances. A bubble inflates asset prices. A government promises more than it can deliver. First, lenders adjust. Interest rates rise. Terms tighten. But once doubt becomes certainty, the system snaps. Credit is not rationed gradually. It disappears suddenly. No example illustrates this better than the Great Depression. In the 1920s, the world ran on borrowed optimism. Easy credit fueled speculation, industrial expansion, and consumer spending. When markets crashed in 1929, the real damage came not from falling stock prices, but from frozen credit. Banks stopped lending. Businesses couldn't roll over debt. Consumers couldn't borrow. The economic engine seized. Factories closed not because demand vanished overnight, but because financing did. Countries tied together through trade and credit fell together. Germany's banking collapse echoed across Europe. The United States contracted violently. This was not a failure of production. It was a failure of trust. After World War II, the world tried to prevent this from happening again. Institutions were built to stabilize credit flows. Central banks, international lenders, safety nets. The idea was simple. When private credit retreats, public credit must step in. But this solution carried its own risk. If governments became the lender of last resort, what restrained them? The late 20th century offered a brutal answer. In the 1980s and 1990s, Latin American nations borrowed heavily to fuel development. Cheap global credit flooded in. Growth followed briefly, Then interest rates rose. Debt burdens exploded. Suddenly, countries like Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil found themselves locked out of capital markets. Credit vanished. Currencies collapsed. Living standards fell. These nations did not fail because they lacked resources. They failed because they lost access to trust. Modern economies are even more dependent on credit than those of the past. Today, most money is credit. Bank deposits are loans. Mortgages are promises decades long. Government bonds are faith in future taxation. When credit flows, economies feel stable. When it stops, even wealthy nations can unravel quickly. The 2008 global financial crisis revealed this reality in stark detail. Banks distrusted each other. Interbank lending froze. Entire financial systems teetered on the brink. Governments intervened, not out of generosity, but necessity, because they understood what history had already taught. When credit dies, collapse follows. But why does credit stop? Because credit is not based on numbers. It's based on psychology. Trust that rules will hold. Trust that contracts will be honored. Trust that tomorrow exists. When trust breaks, whether through corruption, inflation, default, or political instability, credit evaporates. And without credit, modern economies cannot breathe. Today, the world once again stands on borrowed confidence. Debt levels are historically high. Governments rely on constant refinancing. Markets assume stability. Central banks backstop risk. But history whispers a warning. Credit does not fail because people panic. People panic because credit fails. And once belief is gone, no amount of money printing can restore it instantly. This is the enduring lesson of collapsed nations. Empires fall when trust disappears. States fail when promises break. Civilizations crumble when the future is no longer believed in. Credit is invisible until it's gone. And when it stops flowing, the silence that follows is not peace. It is the sound of systems coming apart.